Welcome on this Friday afternoon. Welcome to our lunch lecture with Marisol LeBrón, entitled Decolonizing Scholarship in Feminist Studies, Critical Race and Ethnic Studies. You get a lot with lunch for your money. This event that has brought you to us is brought to you by the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. This is who we are. My name is Clemens Sedmak and I serve as director of this institute. Our initiative in decolonizing scholarship was inspired by my colleague Meredith Chesson, a faculty fellow here at the Nanovic. It has been organized by my colleague Abby Lewis. As always, we owe a lot of gratitude to Becca Prince here in the back, who organizes our event so gracefully. She organizes the mic and the room and the food and the good mood of everybody involved, so thank you, Becca. This is the fourth event in our lecture series, which allows us to look at the question of decolonizing scholarship from different angles and disciplinary perspectives. What does it mean to decolonize philosophy, theology, cultural studies, anthropology, political science? Decolonizing is an intentional effort to rethink thinking, to unlearn learning, and to create new practices. We plan to have some deep conversations that will hopefully inform our practices. Today's event will have a great speaker and a great person introducing the speaker. The one to introduce our guest of honor will be my dear colleague and friend, travel companion and conversation partner, Nanovic faculty fellow, Hildegard Müller. Gundi is a specialist of late antique Latin literature, both poetry and prose, especially the Latin Church Fathers. She's the only person I know who would be able to find aspects of feminist studies and even decolonizing feminist studies in Augustine. She has published a critical edition of a part of Augustine's Psalm sermons, Enarrationes in Psalmos, for the CSCL series. This is a scholar in the true sense of the word, i.e. a person who has spent endless hours appropriating a field and making it her own. And from this field, Gundi can make many connections. A true scholar is a bridge builder, a pontifex. Gundi can tell you the latest news about the gender-just version of the term pontifex. Gundi will build the bridge now between these general remarks and a wonderful lecture by a wonderful speaker. Thank you, Gundi, for introducing Marisol.
Hi, everybody. The only reason I'm permitted to do this, and it's a great honor to introduce Marisol, the only reason is that I'm also permitted to hang out at the Nanovic Institute, this very wonderful place where all sorts of thoughts and people meet. My research doesn't hold a candle to what we are hearing about from Marisol. So Marisol LeBrón, as you can see on the slide, is an associate professor of feminist studies, critical race and ethnic studies. And I find this connection really interesting because it also shows that this is where pure history, so to speak, the academic stuff that I do in my life, abuts actionism and activism, abuts working towards a more just and a more equal society. Her fields of research are social inequality, policing, violence, and protest. She's currently at the University of California at Santa Cruz, where she arrived at via the University of Texas in Austin, Dickinson College, and Duke University. She has degrees from NYU in American Studies, her PhD is from NYU, and a BA in Comparative American Studies and Latin American Studies from Oberlin College. Now, all her publications are, so far, somehow connected to the island of Puerto Rico, with which I have a certain connection because I have a number of students from there who do medieval studies, interestingly. Her most important first book was Policing Life and Death, Race, Violence and Resistance in Puerto Rico, which came out in 2019, and in that same year, two publications came out that were sort of connected to a train of events that started with the disastrous Hurricane Maria in the year of 2017, in September 2017, and the fallout of this hurricane, which caused an economic crisis, caused protests in Puerto Rico, and finally caused the ouster of the then governor of Puerto Rico. One of these books is called, punningly and really interestingly, Against Puerto Rico, Lessons from the Verano Boricua. The Verano Boricua being the protest movement that happened in 2019. And the other one is an edited volume called Aftershocks of Disaster, Puerto Rico before and after the storm. She is currently working on two book projects, which I find fascinating, one of which actually goes beyond her Puerto Rican interests. It's called, tentatively, Up Against the Wall, Policing and the Making of Latins. So the identity that is created by the negative side, by how people are being treated in, I would assume, the US in general, and not just Puerto Rico. And the other one is called, again, tentatively, Shared Geographies of Resistance, Puerto Ricans and the Uses of Solidarity. I would like to add that something I find really fascinating is that Marisol has two really important online projects going on. One is called The Abusable Past, and is a platform where she's one of the members who take care of this platform and have created it, which is a site for, let's say, radical history, where you can talk about activist history and in all shapes and forms and subjects. And the other one is called the Puerto Rico Syllabus, and provides materials, teaching materials, on the current debt and economic crisis in Puerto Rico. And of course, Marisol, with that background, is also very much a public scholar and has published in the Washington Post, in the Guardian, and on Truth Out. So this is an extremely interesting background to come from, and I am very much looking forward to her paper, Debt and Decolonial Feminist Resistance in Puerto Rico. May I ask you to give us your lecture, Marisol, and thank you very much for being here with us.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to just give me a second, put this lapel mic on. While I'm doing that, I want to thank everyone at the Nanovic for this invitation. I think this might be the only time, as you can tell from my bio, that I've given a talk at a Institute for European Studies, but I'm excited for the challenge. I'm really excited, and I think this lecture series I've been kind of following it as it's been going on online, and it's really cool, and I'm excited to be part of this conversation. I want to thank Abby Lewis, although I think she's not here today, unfortunately, and also Becca Prince for really coordinating this visit and making it a really seamless process. So I'm going to talk about the contemporary Puerto Rican debt crisis and the ways in which feminists have try to respond to it. This is a paper that draws from an article that I published in Science Journal, which is a feminist journal. So if you want to know more, you can check out the work there. But also, please, if this is something that interests you, do check out the Puerto Rico syllabus. It's puertoricosyllabus.com, and it's a site and a resource that a collective of us have really curated to provide accessible entry points into learning about the Puerto Rican debt crisis, because part of how the debt crisis functions is through obfuscating information about how the debt works, right? And so much of it seems like it's about bonds and Wall Street investments and pensions and things like that seem really complicated to understand and are overly financialized language. And we try to create accessible resources for understanding what's actually happening, and most importantly, what's often left out in narratives, what's happening on the ground in Puerto Rico in terms of how the debt crisis is affecting people's lives. And I'll talk a little bit about that today, but please do, if you're interested, check that out. And it's a very accessible, I think, resource. So I'll go ahead and get started. And thank you all for being here on a beautiful, gorgeous day inside with the shades drawn. Very much appreciate it. All right. All right. Scholars, journalists, and other social commentators are increasingly turning to the realm of the affective to make sense of Puerto Rico's prolonged descent into crises resulting from colonial capitalism. Political and economic indicators alone don't seem capable of capturing the effects of multiple successive crises experienced by Puerto Ricans in the archipelago and its diaspora. This is especially true following the federal imposition of a fiscal control board to oversee the archipelago's finances in 2016 and the devastating effects of Hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017. After more than a decade of slow-motion economic collapse, 2 back-to-back hurricanes came to wash away any remaining illusions that progress and prosperity were possible under the conditions dictated by colonialism. After Hurricane Maria devastated the archipelago's infrastructure, accelerated thousands of premature deaths, and caused tens of thousands to migrate northward, words like fear, hopelessness, exhaustion, numbness, anger, resignation, abandonment, isolation, and depression circulated in popular discourse to characterize the general affective tenor of those in the archipelago as well as the swelling ranks of the diaspora. Anthropologist Yarimar Bonilla notes that following Hurricane Maria, Puerto Ricans were, quote, forced into an affective reckoning with the kinds of structural violence that they had been enduring for decades, end quote. In particular, Puerto Ricans seem to be full of negative affect. Following the storm, an entire culture industry sprang into action to save Puerto Ricans from their own bad feelings. Social media campaigns proclaimed hashtag Puerto Rico se levanta, or Puerto Rico rises, and hashtag Puerto Rico strong, hoping to shift the emotional register away from despair and resignation towards resilience and a bootstrap can-do mindset. As psychoanalyst Patricia Navoa Ortega points out, however, quote, these discourses emphasize individual responsibility, but they do not necessarily reflect the government's responsibility towards us. When we identify with these discourses, they become exigencies in our mourning process, end quote. While Puerto Ricans were constantly urged to harness an optimism that can only be described as cruel, given the struggles that mark everyday life for wide swaths of the population, many rejected the injunction to be content and put on a brave face. While overwhelming and potentially consuming, negative affect is in many ways the emotional response that seems the most appropriate given the situation confronting Puerto Ricans. As the theorist CNI suggests, negative affect often arises due to, quote, the predicaments posed by a general state of obstructed agency with respect to other human actors or the social as such, end quote. In Puerto Rico, the obstructed agency created and sustained by structural relations of domination, such as colonialism and racial capitalism more broadly, generate a range of negative responses. While they are born of an obstructed agency, we should understand these affective conditions as generative rather than stunted. In other words, Puerto Ricans don't need to get over their negative affect generated by a colonial crisis, nor do they need to demonstrate how well equipped they are to withstand the onslaught of death and destruction that makes up the colonial quotidian. What many people actually mean when they say that Puerto Ricans have to be more resilient. In today's talk, I want to think through the terrain of possibility created by coraje, the coraje that hangs thick in the air in Puerto Rico these days. In Spanish, coraje has a dual meaning, referring to courage as well as anger or rage. Derived from the Latin root cor, meaning heart, coraje, in both senses of the word, comes from the heart and you feel it, as writer Mara Negron puts it. Here, I will focus on the latter, more negative meaning of the word in order to show how and why coraje has emerged as one of the most potent responses to the ongoing crisis of colonial capitalism in Puerto Rico. Building from feminist theorizations of rage and anger, I understand coraje as an essential political emotion necessary for structural transformation. Of course, the radical potential of coraje is precisely what makes it a target of repression. Throughout this talk, I traced the state's preoccupation with the rising coraje being articulated by Puerto Ricans against the current political economic situation marked by the debt crisis. Tellingly, Women have become the face of this political repression as they are among the most affected by U.S. and Puerto Rican austerity policies. Feminists have been at the forefront of an insurgent activism on the Puerto Rican left, making up both a large part of the rank and file as well as more visible figures in anti-austerity and anti-colonial organizing. The examples that I shared today not only illustrate the transformative potential of coraje, but also the anxieties of the state that are provoked when people organize for social change through a politics and performance of rage. So, part one, coraje as a political emotion. So in his essay on violence in Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon expresses concern with the ways that colonial violence often causes colonized subjects to react with rage. For Fanon, one of the challenges of decolonization centers on how colonized subjects can move beyond rage, which he suggests keeps colonized people either semi-immobilized or causes them to lash out. Fanon notes that while decolonization cannot occur without a revolutionary violence that seeks to utterly remake the world, rage can be an impediment to that change. A product of colonization, rage can thwart political transformation and thus must be managed and overcome. In this, arguably one of the most canonical decolonial texts, we can see that rage is positioned as a psychological liability that, if left unchecked, is likely to harm colonized subjects and their movements for freedom. By looking to the work of feminist theorists, however, we can recuperate rage as an essential component of an intersectional decolonial praxis. Rage can be volatile and dangerous, as Fanon suggests, but that energy is part of what makes it so politically transformative. Feminist scholars, particularly Black and Indigenous feminists, have argued that rage functions as an optic that reveals both existing harm as well as paths forward grounded in justice and healing. For these scholars, attempts to dismiss or quell rage, particularly those grounded in notions of respectability and appropriate political address, serve to uphold oppressive structures and relationships. Indigenous scholar Rachel Flowers positions Indigenous people's anger and resentment as a legitimate and necessary response to ongoing colonialism and state violence. Flowers notes that this decolonial rage is not irrational or all-encompassing. Rather, it is aimed at the very structures and techniques that brought it into being in the first place. For Flowers, quote, "To disregard anger and resentment as destructive emotions is an uncritical move to absolve the unforgiven, whereby blame is placed on the injured party, who is seen as an irrational blockage, blinded by their rage compared to the reasonable apologist," end quote. Black and Indigenous feminist scholars have maintained that the suppression of rage is part of a colonial tactic of subjugation. According to Bell Hooks, quote, "To perpetuate and maintain white supremacy, white folks have colonized Black Americans, and a part of that colonizing process has been teaching us to repress our rage, to never make them targets of the anger we feel about racism," end quote. We must understand the radical praxis embedded in a politics of rage as stemming from a desire not for inclusion in an unequal and unjust system, but in a desire to completely upend and destroy the structures that generate feelings of rage among the oppressed and marginalized. In this way, feminists have shown us that an intersectional and decolonial politics of rage helps rather than hurts the work of, quote, "blowing the colonial world to smithereens," as Fanon puts it. Although it has not received sustained scholarly attention, coraje has undoubtedly served as a long-standing response to colonialism in Puerto Rico. Although coraje might form a through line of anti-colonial struggle in Puerto Rico, it has come to occupy a much more prominent position within the political sphere over the past 2 decades, and has done so in a way that is deeply raced, class, and gendered. The deepening of the debt crisis provoked by a collapse of colonial capitalist development during the late 20th century on the one hand, and the attendant rise of regimes of austerity and repression to manage the fallout on the other, have unleashed the widespread discontent and rage among Puerto Ricans, particularly those who occupy the most vulnerable positions within society. Debt, as philosopher Mauricio Larrazzo argues is, above all, I feel like I have mispronounced that, and I have probably a lot of Italian scholars in the room, and it's slightly humiliating. So debt is, above all, a relation of power that redistributes risk, responsibility, and harm. For Lazzarato, debt is, quote, the expression of an asymmetry of forces, a power to prescribe and impose modes of future exploitation, domination, and subjection, end quote. Debt functions to essentially rob the indebted subject of their individual and collective future in service to the market. Of course, these relations of force expressed through debt are not evenly distributed, despite the abstract figure of Lazzarato's indebted man, and are more acutely experienced by those who are already marginalized as a result of colonization, race, gender, class, sexuality, citizenship status, and disability. Debt regimes create not only economic entanglements and obligations, but also collective and individual subjectivities as people are called upon to internalize and enact the logics of the very political and economic processes that brutalize them. Speaking about how indebted subjectivity is deployed in Puerto Rico, feminist philosopher Rocio Zambrana explains, quote, the indebted is disempowered when established as culpable. In need of heeding an injunction to pay with life itself through austerity, debt restructuring deals, taxation, the indebted colony is summoned to pay with life itself through raised utility costs, lost pensions, foreclosed homes, evictions from private and public housing, unaddressed gender violence, end quote. With this in mind, we should understand coraje as an affective condition stoked by the violence of decolonialism that has been imposed on Puerto Ricans for over 2 decades. Coraje demands the abolition of the contemporary creditor-debtor relation, as well as the colonial capitalist, white supremacist, and heteropatriarchal structures that birthed it. 2, the girl who breathed fire. On May 1st, 2017, tens of thousands of Puerto Ricans took to the streets of San Juan for May Day demonstrations called by labor unions, student activists, religious groups, and human rights organizations. While May Day demonstrations in Puerto Rico are often able to gather hundreds, if not thousands, of people together in opposition to the latest assault on the working classes, May Day 2017 was a little different. This was the first May Day following the federal imposition of a fiscal control board. In response to the archipelago's deepening debt crisis, sorry, also I keep hitting the mic if you're getting feedback. In response to the archipelago's deepening debt crisis, Obama signed the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act, or PROMESA, bill into law in June 2016. PROMESA, which means promise in Spanish, promised little more than a deepening of the colonial relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States under the guise of economic recovery. The PROMESA bill created a federally appointed fiscal control board to oversee the archipelago's finances. The fiscal control board, or La Junta, as locals call it, has the power to override the Commonwealth government and implement austerity measures in order to service the debt. By the time the workers and leftists in Puerto Rico were preparing for May Day, La Junta had announced a number of austerity measures attacking the public good. As a result, May Day 2017 was one of the largest protests in the archipelago's history, with nearly 100,000 protesters. Protesters demanded a citizen's audit of the debt, an overall restructuring of the debt, the protection of public institutions from privatization, and an end to austerity measures that disproportionately impact the archipelago's poor and working classes, demands that still remain to this day. Although starting from various locations in San Juan, the marchers all converged at the Milla de Oro, or the Golden Mile, in Hato Rey, which is the archipelago's financial district. So you can think about it as like the Wall Street of San Juan, right? So this is where all of the banks and venture funds and all of that are located. The Milla de Oro is not only the heart of the banking industry, but also, unironically, where the offices of La Junta are located. The Milla de Oro seems to be a site where much of the coraje being felt by Puerto Ricans that day was produced. There, along the wide boulevards of the Milla de Oro, sat buildings belonging to the local and international banks and funds profiting off of Puerto Rico's debt. People poured into the streets on May Day to express their anger and utter frustration with the way that the archipelago's banking elites were assisting in the pillaging of the public good and ensuring profits for U.S. and international financial interests at the expense of Puerto Rican society's most vulnerable. People marched to protest the closure of hundreds of public schools, the shuttering of hospitals, cuts to employee benefits and protections, and the cloak and dagger nature of La Junta's decision-making processes regarding how to repay and how to restructure the debt. Once in the Milla de Oro, the march took a turn as protesters encountered walls of police in riot gear, which is pictured here in the slide. The police initiated a series of violent confrontations when mass protesters started to break the windows of financial institutions and spray paint messages on their walls. Police attacked protesters with batons, rubber bullets, and tear gas in order to protect the insured private property of multinational banks directly implicated in Puerto Rico's debt. Those protesters who tried to escape the clouds of chemical irritants and the impact of weapons on their bodies were chased, corralled, and arrested. According to federal authorities, in the midst of the chaos, 2 individuals approached the broken windows of Centro Popular, the headquarters of Banco Popular, and unsuccessfully tried to set fire to some paper on the other side of the bashed-in windows. Police arrested Nina Dros Franco for the attempted arson as she was lying on a street blocking a line of riot police. Local police reportedly identified Dros by her clothes and shock of bright pink hair. Although 20 people were arrested that day, Dros was the only one charged with federal crimes carrying heavy minimum sentences. The day after the May Day protest, Dros was transferred to federal custody and charged with attempting to set fire to a bank. The full weight of the local and federal security apparatus came down on Dros, threatening to prosecute her to the fullest extent of the law, which could mean spending up to 20 years in prison. Federal prosecutors positioned Dros as a dangerous political figure, whom authorities were fortunate to intercept before she could do more serious damage. Dros's appearance and lifestyle were used repeatedly by prosecutors in order to alienate her from a potentially sympathetic public fed up with La Junta and the vulture capitalists circling the archipelago. 6 feet tall and covered in tattoos, Dros was a fixture of the punk scene and worked steadily as an alternative model under the name Nina Riot. Dros had a small role as a fire breather in the 2013 film Runner Runner, which if you've never heard of it, me either, but apparently Ben Affleck was maybe in it, I don't But authorities latched onto this, often referring to her as the girl who breathes fire, to cement her in the minds of the public as simultaneously seductive and destructive. Artist Molly Crabapple, who wrote about the case for The Baffler, noted that Dros's story quickly became, quote, the lurid saga of a bikini model arsonist who tried to burn down a bank, end quote. Dros was presented as a dangerous terrorist on the one hand, and as attorney Ramon Acevedo put it, a pro-independence pervert and degenerate on the other. This conservative, misogynistic signposting succeeded in focusing public attention on Dros, her appearance, her personality, her lifestyle, and away from the reasons why she and tens of thousands of Puerto Ricans were in the streets on May Day armed with a burning coraje directed at the institutions of colonial capitalism. Throughout the trial, Dros was denied bail and held in federal custody. While detained, Dros spoke against the medical abuse she suffered as federal authorities withheld medication needed to manage her chronic pain and anxiety. Dros also reported experiencing harassment, abuse, and arbitrary punishment at the hands of her jailers, including extended solitary confinement and isolation. Dros's mother shared that she had experienced repeated sexual aggression at the hands of her jailers at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Guaynabo, including forced nudity and being filmed while naked. Dros's experiences of gender violence in detention illuminate the consequences that women potentially face as a result of their activism against the colonial state and capital. Against this backdrop of repression, Dros entered into a plea deal with the prosecutors in order to avoid the lengthy federal prison sentence that seemed all but assured. On June 12, 2018, Dros was sentenced to 37 months in prison and 3 years of probation. Dros would be transferred to a federal prison in Tallahassee, Florida, to serve out her sentence. Her exile to a federal facility in the U.S. mainland was part of an effort to distance and isolate Dros from her base of support and in order to keep her coraje contained. Dross became a high-profile example of what happens when people express their coraje against the current regime of colonial debt governance and call for change. On February 8, 2018, the Committee of Friends and Family of Nina Dross Franco issued a press release that read, quote, "The unequivocal goal of this prosecution has been of a political and repressive character to teach a lesson to people who seek to exercise their constitutional rights to freedom of expression and others in the face of a panorama of increased austerity," end quote. On the whole, Dross's prosecution functioned to shift attention away from the role of colonial officials and the immiseration of the local population. As critical geographer Javier Arbona argues, the framing of Nina Dross as a, quote, psychologically damaged female object, end quote, who behaved in irrational and excessive ways was, quote, deployed to tarnish the causes of opposition to the junta, end quote. These popular renderings of Dross sought to hide how widespread the feelings of coraje that she carried with her that day were for many Puerto Ricans. Coupled with the disreputable image of Dross circulated by the media and political elites, her aggressive prosecution functioned to warn people that their displays of coraje could cause the full weight of the law to come crashing down on them. Throughout her incarceration, local activists and supporters organized to support Dross and denounced not only the severity of her prosecution, but also the conditions of isolation imposed on her. Their support took the form of petitions, letter writing, community updates, and protests, denouncing the repression of anti-debt activism that made Dross and all her supporters potential targets. Nina Dross returned to Puerto Rico on November 26, 2019, to complete the remaining 3-year probationary portion of her sentence. Dross's experience helps us to understand the long simmering and widespread coraje that explodes with periodic starts and stops to demand a different future for Puerto Ricans. Coraje in its duality serves as a means of survival for colonized subjects. Whether it's a spark animating protests in the streets or a source of steadfastness and resistance behind bars, coraje is a refusal of the grinding punishment of colonial violence in all of its forms. As Dross told journalists who met her at the airport, quote, "The thing that most kept me alive was the coraje that I have inside me to be better and to make ourselves better. That coraje to see things the way that people don't even see them, because you don't believe in yourself, because you have a fear of I don't even know what. We are destroying ourselves because we are cowards," end quote. While Dross was using coraje in the sense of courage, I like to think that there is a coraje, a powerful rage inside that drives a desire to see and confront those things that are destroying us. 3. Historia de un atropello. I'll explain what atropello is because I feel like that's a super weird word. So, the group Jornada Se Acabaron las Promesas called for members of the public to join them at the Milla de Oro on February 20th, 2018 for a protest to set fire to their coraje. I'm supposed to move the slide, sorry. The protest, Enciende tu Coraje, aimed to make manifest the anger and frustration that people felt at the proposed privatization and austerity measures being called for by the Fiscal Control Board in order to service Puerto Rico's debt. La Jornada, which came together following the imposition of Promesa in order to call for its repeal and the removal of La Junta, planned to go to the symbolic heart of the crisis, the Milla de Oro. They plan to set fire to effigies of the Control Board Chairman, Jose Carrion III, U.S. President Donald Trump, and Puerto Rican Governor, disgraced Puerto Rican Governor Ricardo Rosselló, in front of the headquarters of the Fiscal Control Board. The action pinpointed the source of the coraje felt by a multitude of Puerto Ricans, directly indicting the colonial relationship and its agents in the U.S. and Puerto Rico. The action made real and visible the feelings of coraje that so many carried inside of them as a result of these colonial functionaries and institutions, and suggested that if Puerto Ricans could harness that coraje, igniting those feelings and directing them outward, these relations of power and subjugation could be destroyed. In the late afternoon, La Jornada and their supporters began to gather in the Milla de Oro. Scott Barbes, a spokesperson for La Jornada, told reporters they were in the streets that day to protest the anti-democratic policies of La Junta as well as the local and federal government. According to Barbes, La Jornada wanted to make clear who was responsible for the attacks on the Puerto Rican public, to put faces and names to state violence. For protesters that day, all of these actions were implicated in the immiseration of Puerto Ricans through their support for austerity measures that were slowly eroding the public good. This was particularly necessary coming as it did after Hurricane Maria, when people experienced in the flesh how local and federal governments fostered death in order to extract profits. Puerto Ricans were still reeling from the devastation of Hurricane Maria, yet felt the grip of austerity tightening daily. Barbesa explained, "This is a call for us to ignite the coraje that we as Puerto Ricans feel. There is a lot of coraje. The government is walking around blaming Maria for everything when the things we're living through are not due to Maria. These are political and economic decisions that the government is making. Those who have been governing and those who want to block us in order to separate us from the rest of the world are to blame for what happened after Maria because they want to keep us from being a part of this whole world. Those are the criminals. Those are the ones who have attacked us. We're just trying to create a network of solidarity around the island, centers for mutual aid, constructing homes, and we do that with nothing. This experience after Maria has shown us that yes, we can govern ourselves. We need to govern ourselves rather than be governed. That's the call we're making, to mobilize people. That coraje needs to be shown." The action that day sought to remind Puerto Ricans that the disaster they were still experiencing was anything but man-made. La Jornada pointed to a longer history of austerity and debt exploitation in order to argue that it is not hurricanes alone that cause entire power grids to collapse and thousands to die. For Barbesa and La Jornada, political and economic elites used Hurricane Maria as a cover for the damage that they were in fact responsible for inflicting on Puerto Ricans. With this longer history of organized abandonment and state violence in mind, the burning of effigies that day was not only an expression of outrage, frustration, and anger, coraje, but it was also a symbolic gesture calling for self-determination and self-governance by the people and for the people. What Maria taught Puerto Ricans, according to Barbes and others from La Jornada, was that the government is not there to serve the needs of the people. Instead, it's only the people who will save the people. Through this public display centered around people's growing coraje, La Jornada hoped to ignite a praxis of radical solidarity. The potential for sparking anti-capitalist and anti-colonial consciousness and organizing is exactly what made Enciende Tu Coraje, the demonstration, a target of political repression and violence. The Puerto Rico police were in full force, appearing to outnumber the group of protesters that day approximately 2-1. For most of the demonstration, outfitted in full riot gear, the police formed a protective shield around the protesters and the headquarters of the Fiscal Control Board. About an hour into the demonstration, people associated with La Jornada and other activist groups made a series of remarks speaking out against the closure of public schools, the introduction of charter schools, and attempts to privatize the electric authority, among other austerity measures. Eventually, protesters set fire to the effigies, which caused the police to move in and form a perimeter around the protesters and members of the press. Firefighters extinguished the fires while Scott Barbes made a speech directed to the police, imploring them to join in the protest since they, too, were experiencing the effects of austerity both at home and on the job. Barbes continued to address the crowd, imploring them to join and support the women's strike on March 8th. For La Jornada, it was necessary to recognize the centrality of women's labor and struggle against debt colonialism. It was women, for instance, especially single mothers and black mothers, who were rescuing schools shuttered as a result of austerity for use by the community. It was also women who were on the front lines of the fight to protect public sector employment due to their overrepresentation in certain public sector jobs, such as K-12 public education. Barbes also brought up the incarceration of Nina Dros, encouraging the crowd to draw inspiration from her example. Quote, "During her sentence, she has been tortured, and she continues to resist with dignity, just the same as you all from the depth of the federal prison. She's there being abused. She remains combativa. We must protest that with the same force and energy and combativeness as our comrade does from the hellish conditions of the federal prison." End quote. In various moments throughout the protest, speakers reminded the crowd that women were in many ways leading the fight against debt colonialism in Puerto Rico. Women not only bore the brunt of austerity's impact on Puerto Ricans, but also were increasingly targeted by the state for speaking out and expressing their rage at the system, as Dros had been. After Barbes' comments, the crowd started to disperse and the demonstration came to a close. As the crowd was walking away from the offices of the Fiscal Control Board and towards Roosevelt Avenue, they noticed that the van that had been used for the protest was on the back of a police flatbed, about to be towed away. According to police, the vehicle was supposedly being impounded for having fake registration tags. According to Nelson Escudero, an activist with La Jornada who witnessed the events, quote, "We followed the truck to ask what was going on, and he didn't respond. The driver got into the truck, and when people were walking in front, he floored it. At that moment, Alejandro Medina ended up under the police flatbed," end quote. Police accused poet Alejandro Medina of throwing himself at the police truck while it was already in motion, but witnesses deny this. Although the exact sequence of events remains somewhat unclear, what is clear is that when people rushed to help Medina as he laid bloody on the ground, the police closed in on protesters and started to shove and hit them with their batons, effectively making it difficult for Medina to receive first aid. Police arrested 4 individuals after Medina was hit with the police flatbed, and Scott Barbes was arrested while attempting to aid his comrade. Medina was also reportedly hit by police batons once he was already hurt on the ground awaiting medical care. Police handcuffed and injured Medina before he was finally taken to the Centro Médico in Rio Piedras. Puerto Ricans will often refer to their experiences of injustice and inequality as an atropello. Puerto Ricans discuss things like the imposition of promesa, the undemocratic whims of the Fiscal Control Board, round after round of austerity cuts, the kleptocracy of local elites, and police repression as akin to being run over or steamrolled. Un atropello. The police actions at the end of La Jornada's Enciende tu Coraje demonstration made the atropello contra el pueblo, the steamrolling of the people that fueled so much of the coraje that day, literal. The policing of La Jornada's action that day demonstrates the extent to which the police function to maintain a colonial capitalist order and eliminate social dissent through violence. So, part 4, and pardon the language, I hope you die, bitch. So, and it will make sense in a second. Puerto Rico's colonial status means that it cannot access traditional Chapter 9 bankruptcy protections available to many U.S. jurisdictions in order to deal with its massive debt. Congress has instead authorized Puerto Rico to restructure its debt through a process known as Title III. The Puerto Rican government and its public corporations owe $123 billion to bondholders and public employee pension systems, making the Title III proceedings the largest debt restructuring case in U.S. history. As journalist Juan Gonzalez notes, Title III grants an immense amount of power and discretion to a federally appointed proceeding judge, further removing power from the hands of Puerto Ricans. Judge Laura Taylor Swain from the Southern District of New York was appointed to oversee the debt restructuring proceedings. The first and potentially most devastating debt repayment measure that Swain would be ruling on was the COFINA agreement drawn up by La Junta. COFINA, and this is the feel in the weeds, because again, this debt financialization language is purposefully about obfuscating responsibility. So bear with me for a second. The COFINA debt, which carries a $17 billion principal, has never been audited despite serious challenges to its constitutionality. So COFINA creditors are essentially made up of 2 classes. Junior bondholders, most of whom are local bondholders and pensioners, so people like teachers, people who worked in public service, they had public sector jobs, and then senior bondholders, most of whom are vulture hedge funds, right? So the people who buy debt for pennies on the dollar. The coalition that claims to represent COFINA bondholders in the Puerto Rican government's Title III case is mostly made up of these senior bondholders, so of these kind of debt capitalists. The COFINA agreement before Judge Swain would create a financial bonanza for these vulture capitalists on the backs of Puerto Ricans already experiencing the effects of austerity and infrastructural collapse. The COFINA agreement would pay back bondholders by raising the IVU, which is a local sales tax, for the next 40 years. The COFINA agreement carries disastrous consequences for Puerto Ricans, especially the most vulnerable, by diverting funding from healthcare, education, and disaster recovery, for instance, and levying an 11.5% sales tax, which is higher than any of the 50 states. Puerto Rican activists created outreach campaigns from petitions to phone banking to convince Swain to reject the COFINA agreement because the bondholders' claims were in direct conflict with the funding for essential public services. On February 4th, 2019, Swain approved the COFINA agreement, calling it, quote, a significant step on the path towards Puerto Rico's financial recovery, economic stability, and prosperity, end quote. Swain's approval ignited the coraje of many Puerto Ricans, including that of Elimar Chaldon Sierra. So, and I realized that text is really small, but I'm going to read it, so it's okay. Chardon, a local music teacher and artist, called Swain to express her disapproval of the judge's Cofina ruling and to give her a piece of her mind. According to Chardon, quote, I called the trashy Judge Swain because she passed the law. I participated in an artistic campaign about the consequences of Cofina. After she approved the law, I called her enraged, and I told her that I hope she found herself homeless without health insurance and that she died. And I said, I hope you die, bitch. I also said that I knew that she would investigate me because of what I said, because I know that freedom of expression does not exist for the colonies, end quote. Chardon was right. A week after she called Swain, 3 FBI investigators showed up at the school where Chardon worked to interview her about her comments. They arrested her and charged her with making harassing telephone calls and interstate communication, which carries a maximum penalty of 2 years in prison. As in the case of Nina Droz, federal authorities attempted to embed Chardon within a larger terrorist network. According to Chardon, quote, and what most piqued my interest was when they insisted that I tell them if I knew machateros or other insurgents. And the machateros were a group in, the 1970s and 80s. They were actually a diasporic group, right? They actually did like the Wells Fargo heist in Connecticut and things like that. But there was an armed insurgent group advocating for Puerto Rican independence. So they insisted I tell them if I knew machateros or other insurgents. That makes me think that they are still afraid of Puerto Ricans claiming their rights, and much less the human right to independence. They asked me if I knew of someone planning an attack, and I answered, I do not. It is true. I cannot lie. They asked me about organizations that I thought were dead, end quote. It was not Chardon calling Swain a bitch and telling her that she wishes for bad things to befall her that concerned the authorities. Instead, it was the fear that the coraje that pushed Chardon to call Swain and curse her out might turn into the kinds of radical action embedded in the long history of anti-colonial armed insurgency in Puerto Rico. Civil rights organizations and anti-austerity groups rallied in support of Chardon and denounced her prosecution as politically motivated state repression. On March 6, 2019, representatives from a number of civil rights organizations and legal advocacy groups held a press conference to alert the public to the implications of Chardon's case. Annette Martinez Orabona, executive director of the Caribbean Institute for Human Rights, said, quote, if freedom of expression does not protect the right to be outraged, then it's useless. The absolute defenselessness in which Puerto Ricans find themselves is aggravated when the judicial system, instead of protecting the population, persecutes it. Elimar's case reflects precisely how broken the system is and that the state does not provide the minimum protections it owes to its most vulnerable people, end quote. For civil rights advocates, Chardon's case represented a dangerous rollback of the basic right to protest and dissent, rights that are always suspended or under attack in colonial contexts. Other advocates drew attention to the sense of obstructed agency associated with colonial rule that was behind Chardon's remarks. In a statement titled, We Have the Right to Coraje, Maribel Narvaez, executive director of Kilómetro Cero, a civilian group fighting for law enforcement transparency and accountability, wrote, quote, is it harassment to call a public official who has not been elected or appointed by the people of Puerto Rico and who makes decisions about the future of that people? What happens when, in a time of extreme crisis, citizens have no role in decision-making processes? Social peace is broken, end quote. Here, we see a close relationship between coraje and a sense of frustrated or constrained agency that is endemic to relations of domination. In this sense, coraje now is not only a release, but a form of necessary protest within a terrain shaped by colonial capitalism. And what makes coraje such an intense object of law enforcement concern is that it lays the groundwork for solidarity and mobilization as more and more people are subjected to the individualizing effects of the obstructed agency. It is in the collective where the potential to mobilize coraje into a potent and efficacious political motion is found. On August 30th, 2019, Chardon rejected a plea deal for a guilty plea in exchange for no jail time and a year of supervision. Following her client's rejection of the deal, prominent movement lawyer Mariana Nogales told the press, quote, the content of the call was discourse against the Cofina agreement. The dire consequences of this agreement would have on the lives of Puerto Ricans and in particular on her since she's a teacher, end quote. Indeed, Chardon's rage, as she noted, stemmed in large part from her experiencing firsthand the effects of the debt crisis on her students and colleagues. Working in a sector uniquely impacted by austerity as a teacher, but especially a music teacher, is what created the sense of urgency and explosiveness behind Chardon's attempts, along with others, to stop the passage of the COFINA agreement. When those efforts failed, Chardon refused to play the role of the proper colonial subject who silently accepts deadly violence and exploitation in the name of progress. Instead, she shared her fantasies of revenge with the most direct source of her coraje. In October 2019, the federal prosecutor offered to drop the charges against Chardon as part of a diversion program, which would also allow her to complete 100 hours of community service without having to plead guilty. On December 16, 2020, the charges against Chardon were dismissed with prejudice after she completed the agreed-upon diversion program. Chardon did not have to allocute or apologize to the court for her phone call to the judge, and her record is completely clean. The disastrous effects of the COFINA agreement, however, is sure to leave a mark on Chardon and other Puerto Ricans. So I'm just going to conclude here. The examples that I discussed today demonstrate the ways that activists and ordinary citizens mobilize coraje in order to navigate the obstructed agency created by the constraints of colonial capitalism in contemporary Puerto Rico. Coraje has emerged as a key target of state repression because it has the potential to create networks of solidarity grounded in a refusal of the current order, a shared understanding that this current situation cannot continue. Police and local elites target expressions of coraje in the hopes of appealing to a colonial respectability politics and norms around emotional decorum. One is not supposed to try to set fire to the vestibule of the Centro Popular. One should not burn effigies in the streets. One should not call a sitting judge a bitch and tell her they hope she dies. One should not shout and bang on pots, refusing to leave the streets until the governor resigns, as happened in 2019. One should not march through the streets with a guillotine demanding the governor's head. But these are less indicators of political irrationality and incivility, and much more an indicator of the limitations placed on Puerto Ricans' ability to challenge the colonial structures governing their everyday lives and accelerating their deaths. Given the constraints placed on Puerto Ricans, coraje can be understood as a weapon of the weak, in the words of James Scott. The unmasked colonial state violence and ignite strong networks of transformative solidarity. In their collective coraje, Puerto Ricans who have felt silenced by colonial capitalism, misogyny, queer antagonism, and racism have found a way to push back and articulate a different way of living in Puerto Rico. Coraje then is not just about destruction, but rather about hope and a commitment to the creation of new worlds out of the ashes of the old, despite the repression and violence that seems all but guaranteed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marisol, for an extremely moving and impactful paper that taught us about the interconnections of the different forms of violence by policing, violence by financial misdeeds, and not least violence against women, in the same context of still, unfortunately, colonialism. But you also taught us about what can be done about it, to now and again break out in rage, and to now and again show our courage. So I thought that this was a paper that opens very many questions. So may I open the floor to questions for myself? Well, yeah. Okay. Please, for all of you, speak into the mic because we are recording this.
Thank you very much, Dr. LeBrón, for a fascinating lecture. At the beginning of your lecture, you spoke a bit about resilience. Mm-hmm. And obviously, in these kinds of, often in disasters, and this idea of resilience is invoked, right, as a way to respond. And obviously, as you said, the situation facing Puerto Ricans well predates Hurricane Maria. But I was wondering if you could speak a bit about the relationship between resilience and this coraje, both of which are kind of seem to be coming from somewhat similar kind of ideas of pushing forward, moving ahead, but from very different sort of vantage points. I was wondering if you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for that. So, I mean, like, Yanimar Bonilla is one of my collaborators, and she said it best. she's like, I'm so sick and tired of being resilient, right? And I think a lot of Puerto Ricans, particularly Puerto Ricans in the archipelago, but also those who are forced into the diaspora, right, also feel that way, right? I think if the problems that Puerto Rico faces didn't start in 2016 with Promesa, and they did not start in 2017 with Hurricane Maria, right? And so, this has been a kind of crisis that we can say is a colonial crisis that dates back to 1898 or even longer if we're talking about Puerto Rican or Spanish colonialism in Puerto Rico, right? But at the very least, this kind of like contemporary crisis, which I would characterize as a specific form of colonialism that's articulated through this kind of debt and austerity crisis, and what it provokes, is at least 2 decades of sustained kind of crisis. And in 2007, under Luis Fortuño, we have Ley 7, which lays off tens of thousands of public sector workers, right? And so this has been a long time where Puerto Ricans have been asked to kind of get by, do more with less, right? And really that's what resilience is asking, right? Is to say because of the kind of way the colonial capitalism is functioning, right, you are gonna have to figure it out, right? And it's what makes you strong, right? And so there's a way in which it's fetishized as a kind of response. So, the kind of ways in which, I think Puerto Ricans showed incredible ingenuity in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, right, gets praised as resilience, right? So the fact that, one of the viral videos that circulated after Hurricane Maria, if people saw it, was this guy that had created a washing machine with a bike, and it's he pedaled the bike and it spun this bucket that washed his clothes and whatever, right? Because there was no running water, right? And no electricity and no anything. And so instead of seeing that as look at the tremendous situation that Puerto Ricans are put in, that the most basic kind of human tasks, right, you have to literally build this contraption to do it. It's oh, look at Puerto Rican resilience, right? And so it's a neoliberal kind of model of personhood. Is very individualizing, and it's also about saying that if you are having a hard time, right, dealing with the various crises and disasters that have impacted everyday life for many Puerto Ricans, that the problem is you, right? That you need to be more kind of resilient. So, it's very much rooted in this kind of neoliberal discourse. Coraje, on the other hand, the kind of argument that I'm making is Coraje is the response, which is I'm fucking done being resilient, and I shouldn't have to be resilient, and the structure needs to change, right? Because I cannot go on like this anymore. And so there's this way in which, I think, as Puerto Ricans kept having to be forced to deal with these crises, and not only a failed response but a purposeful response to make people's everyday lives worse, right? That people got fed up, and that's so for me they're kind of I think this duality, like you said, where there's a kind of elite response to these disasters that's about resilience and promoting a resilient kind of discourse, and then I think what I argue is this kind of coraje response, which is about a complete rejection of that, right? And I think calling out this way in which Puerto Ricans are expected to just keep dealing and suffering through this, right?
Many questions, actually.
Thank you for a great, important talk.
Thank you.
So well done, thanks. I wanted to ask about kind of the dominant culture's framing of Puerto Ricans as the opposite affect, as happy, singing, dancing islanders, and how that comes into conflict with coraje as you understand it and as you unpack it.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're related, right? Because I think that's the whole point, is that, there's this resilience discourse, which is I think a more kind of contemporary discourse that, and Puerto Rico's not immune in that, right? I think that's the discourse that happens as we're confronting climate change, right? All of these kind of, and it's not people shouldn't be resilient, we should be able to withstand kind of problems when they arise, but just the expectation that as conditions worsen, there's not an accountability on the part of the state to deal with that, right? That's the individual's kind of response. But, it's It's funny. So like, I think there's lots of examples of the ways in which like there's a confronting with this like happy islander thing and coraje, right? And so if you can call it a favorite, my favorite example is like, so during the pandemic, so there's this thing in Puerto Rico right now as part of the way of dealing with the debt crisis that has worsened conditions, which is it's called Act 60, and it puts Act 20 and 22, which are basically these acts that created massive tax incentives for non-Puerto Ricans to move to Puerto Rico to start businesses, right? And so the assumption was, this whole trickle-down idea, which is that, these rich, mostly Americans, but definitely not exclusively Americans, but rich Americans are going to come and create jobs. And meanwhile, it's just all these like remote worker crypto bros that come and they don't create anything, right? And except building gated enclaves, right? And so during the pandemic, a lot of people kind of took advantage of these Act 60 laws and were like, I'm going to escape the pandemic and go and live in this tropical paradise. It's going to be amazing. And, Puerto Ricans during the pandemic, the situation in Puerto Rico was there was a toque de queda, so like a curfew. Puerto Ricans were not allowed to leave their houses, right? Because, apparently COVID only comes out after 11, right? And and so there was all of these restrictions that were placed on Puerto Ricans, but not placed on these foreigners. And so, and Puerto Ricans were very diligent about masking and all this stuff, and like people were coming and not masking and all this stuff. And so, Puerto Ricans don't play that. And so like there would be these videos of Puerto Ricans like, driving up next to a car and like throwing a mask and being like, put on your fucking mask, like, whatever. Or the one that went probably most viral at the beginning of the pandemic was this guy that was really aggressive, and in the supermarket, and he wouldn't mask, and he started like kind of getting aggressive with folks, and somebody hit him with a golf club in the face, right? And so there's this way in which, that image, right, where I think the government is trying to say, come here, it's paradise, help us rebuild. Puerto Ricans are like pushing back against that, and that has to do with this coraje feeling, because if you talk to Puerto Ricans now, there's a feeling, and you hear it. I mean, the guy who, I don't watch it, but the Ishmael Cruz, who plays a Hobbit on Lord of the Rings show on Amazon, right? He's the Afro-Puerto Rican, and he talks about, like, he came out last week and said he was trying to buy a house in Puerto Rico, and celebrity, big name kind of celebrity, and he was like that he kept calling realtors trying to get them to show houses, and they wouldn't call him back, they wouldn't show him anything, and then he had his American friend call, and suddenly there was all these listings that he could go see. And so he came out and in these interviews saying they want to create a Puerto Rico without Puerto Ricans, and this is the refrain that you hear now, right? And so there's this way in which Puerto Ricans are expected to be these happy fixtures to serve this new, really settler colonial project growing out of the debt crisis in Puerto Rico. And there's the way in which Puerto Ricans are pushing against that, right? And this gets set up as these irrational, whatever, Puerto Ricans, but it's a very, when you're being displaced, it's a very rational response, right? And so I do think that that's this longer colonial history of this paradise image of Puerto Rico that is coming up with this new colonial reality of the debt crisis, right?
We have a number of questions here and then you. But first,
Hi, thank you so much for that. And I have a lot of questions, but I will be seeing you later, so I'll ask you some of them another time. But the big one I had was, is there a change in character of coraje? Because I'm thinking about, you mentioned that it was maybe the last couple of decades, but I'm thinking about, like, say, the 50s, 60s, 70s, the nationalists, the assault on the US Capitol in the 50s, Marisol LeBrón. Like, would you characterize them as coraje, as a vehicle of coraje, or do you think it's like maybe a longer, like, decolonial affect, or do you think it's something that's had a change in character in the last couple of decades? Because I'm pretty interested by,
Yeah, that's a great question. It's one I try to think through in the paper, the longer version of the paper a little bit, and I think like there's a way in which there's a long history of insurgency, right? That's about a rejection of the colonial order and a frustration with its effects, right? And anger over its effects. And, you read the kind of speeches of, Pedro Albizu Campos or, any of the kind of nationalists, Filiberto Ojeda Rios, in the 70s and 80s, right? And there's an obvious kind of anger at the system, right? And what the system does. For me, I focus on the kind of debt period, right? And the debt crisis, because I think that there's a way in which the discourse is around, I think there's more public discourse around coraje, right? And so it's not that coraje doesn't exist or isn't present in earlier periods, but the framing of it, I think people are using that as a framework more. And so for me, I'm like, okay, well, why is this circulating more? And it seems to have something to do, I think, with, in the aftermath, right, of the failures of, colonial development in Puerto Rico, right, and the obviousness with which the lie of what colonialism promises, there's a frustration, right, that is more present than I think ever because of, I think, the overt nature of some of these colonial relations as they're emerging now under the debt crisis. So, I think the short answer to your question is it's an undercurrent. And I think feminists have been really good at kind of unpacking that, right? In a way that, especially as I mentioned, Black and Indigenous feminists, right? In a way that perhaps has been rejected by others, right? But this iteration is more kind of obvious and forceful in this moment. So, yeah. Hey.
Thank you, first of all, for the talk to start with. And you kind of touched on it already, and that was the first part of my question, so I'll just do the second one. I was kind of thinking about, the NPI and the 60s and stuff. And I think I'll preface the question by kind of saying that I think the occupation of space is something that caught my attention during the presentation, right? Physical, these protests as well. And so I was just wondering if you think that all the displays of coraje have to be public, and kind of thinking back to the MPI and stuff and all the organizing and planning and displays that happen behind closed doors a lot of the times as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't talk about it in this piece, but but I do think there's scales to it, right? Which is there's the public kind of displays, which is what I focus on in the examples in this essay. But I think every day people are navigating that, right? And I think that to me, it's that's part of the general tenor, right? Is this kind of frustration, la maldita colonia, right? And this anger that people have about what it means to live in a colony and the kind of humiliations and injustices that entails, right? Which, I think is part of the everyday fabric of trying to do anything in Puerto Rico. And so I do think there's this way in which there's a kind of personal affect, right? And I think that's, for me, the interesting part, right, of these public displays, because I think what these public displays do is catalyze that potential for solidarity, right? So these people who are feeling that every day, and don't necessarily have an outlet, can be called in, right? And to me, that's what happened in the 2019 protest that ousted Rico, right, the governor, because they were the largest protests in Puerto Rican history precisely because people were incensed, right? And people were this cannot continue. And it became this kind of holder for all of the frustrations that Puerto Ricans are feeling. So it was not only about having Blanquito Riquitillo governor who doesn't know the people he governs, that says sexist, misogynist, racist things, that, helps abet the kind of debt crisis, all of this kind of stuff, but that it was also about La Junta and getting rid of La Junta. It was also about addressing femicides. It was also addressing all of these things. And you saw all of these frustrations that Puerto Ricans were experiencing really come together. And that, to me, is what the potential of Coraje is, right? Because these personal grievances and frustrations were then catalyzed into this larger moment of collective reckoning that tried to change things. So I appreciate your kind of question, because I think it gets us to think about like the scales at which people are navigating these political emotions. So thank you.
We do have time for a few more questions. Yes, there's a question over here.
Hi, I'm Eileen Hunt in political science. I study Mary Wollstonecraft, and she's famous for combining what Amartya Sen called wrath and reason.
Okay.
So effectively combining things that we think are incompatible. We often associate anger or wrath with irrationality.
Right.
And reason with impartiality and emotional distance, and so on. But he believes that what Wollstonecraft did so ingeniously was to combine these in making arguments for the rights of all humans, regardless of race, class, or gender. So I just wondered if you could reflect on that a little bit. Like, what is the challenge going forward for activists and scholars concerned with social justice issues in Puerto Rico? How do we learn to effectively combine wrath and reason?
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I think that's like, so I think that it is like wrath, anger, rage, all of the kind of various ways that it gets kind of mobilized. We see that it gets posed as irrationality, right? And, or as dangerous, right? And, the left, they're not the only people who are using anger, right? We can think about the politics of this contemporary moment and the kind of rising fascism, which we were talking about earlier, that's not only happening in the US, but around the globe, right? And the ways in which that is very much predicated in a kind of basis of anger and resentment and outrage, right? I think this is the thing that becomes like dangerous in some ways about kind of thinking about anger as a political emotion, right? As it cuts both ways, right? Like, so that's one thing that, I've been kind of thinking about, right? But the other kind of, thing is that like, anger gets posed as this kind of like irrational response, right, on the part of the individual. And for me, I think like I'm interested in like how is that actually reflective of a larger like collective social issue, right? And so like in the examples that I am focusing on, right, like you can look at someone who calls a judge and curses her out on the phone and be like, this is like an irrational response, right? But to me, like the focus on like the individual rationality misses what the collective social kind of implications are for it, right? And so, I do think that, so I conclude by saying like that, and in response to that last question, for me, I think the parts that are the most able to successfully harness that, right? And to harness that in a way of like collective social change towards justice, like really do lie in the collective, right? And so like I'm not familiar with the wrath and reason kind of dichotomy, and so I don't know the kind of specifics of that argument, but for me, I think the kind of way in which those can come together, for me, what brings them together is that collective social response, right? So that's kind of like my maybe not so satisfying answer, because I'm not super familiar with the theory, but to me, that's where I see the potential perhaps for like a futurity that is the most promising in it.
I think some would agree with you. I mean, so work is on rational choice theory and the theory of social choice. So it's about the rationality of collective behavior.
Yeah.
Awesome. I mean, so you can argue that, in certain circumstances, when well deployed, anger can be a form of collective rationality.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, I think about that with like the Occupy Wall Street, right? And this notion of like the anger that comes from being the majority and being positioned in this kind of form of economic dispossession, right? Like for me, that's an example of where we see there's a complete rationality to the outrage, right? And that it lies in that collective response, right? But yeah, thank you.
One last question. I think you are No, we have a last question here, and may I ask you to ask your question privately afterwards? Thank you.
Thank you, Marisol, for your wonderful talk. I was wondering, you mentioned the incendio, no, of the reach.
Yeah.
What do we do when that flame, disappears? I'm wondering about post-Occupy Wall Street, now Quincena in Spain, all the social movements, the Arab Springs, after that, and the swing going back, to the alt-right, global scale in a certain way. So I wonder how the rage has changed since right after the aftermath of Hurricane Maria to the present, for instance, and culturally, politically, what do we do with that? How can we sustain that rage, or how can we re-witness the movement?
Yeah, I talk about this a little bit in the larger piece, but I think those moments are explosive, right? And that's kind of what the rage does, is it's that spark, right? And so I think about the 2019 protests also in Puerto Rico to oust the governor, or we can think about the 2020 uprisings in the aftermath of George Floyd here in the U.S. And there are these kind of explosive moments, and then they seem to die out or become lessened in certain ways. And so for me, I think that's not bad. And so why I think that's not bad is because I think that those moments where the flame is lower, if we want to say that, right, instead of died out, but that is lower, is actually where the work gets done that creates the next kind of movement, right? And so it's these moments where those explosions create a change in the discourse, right? And they create a change in the kind of political attitudes and tactics of particular social movements. And when the flame is lower, that's when the grassroots work is happening. That's when political education is happening, right? And the terrain for those movements is shifted and is different, right? It's more generative because of those explosions. So, I think about the Ricky Rosselló, the Renuncia protest in 2019, right? And it's this massive explosion. It gets many wins. And then, I talk about this in Against Puerto Rico in my book, but people talk about, we're waiting for La Segunda round, right? And all this kind of stuff, and the sequel, and there doesn't need to be a sequel, right? Because part of what happens is that has shifted the terrain then, and the discourse, where now there's more of a political openness to some of those discussions that were not previously able to happen, right? And so it actually becomes an opportunity to lay the groundwork for the next kind of movement to happen through that kind of political education work, right? And so I think about La Colectiva Feminista en Construcción in Puerto Rico, which is a feminist group, and they were super active in the 2019 protests, and now they are not in the streets, right? They're not doing any occupation. What they're doing is all political education work, right? And so they're doing work against educating people about the displacement crisis and gentrification in Puerto Rico, right? And that work directly grows out of the kind of work that they did leading up to the Ricky Renuncia protest and its aftermath, right? And in response to kind of how the crisis has shifted in the current moment. So I think that's the natural ebb and flow, right, of these social movements, and that it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a moment where we see that kind of that struggle, right, where it does create an opening for the right or these other kind of groups to come in to struggle over the narrative, right? So it does create new challenges when the next kind of movement does kind of emerge. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you for sticking around.